This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information, or to find out how you can volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Minter. Some Experiences of an Irish R.M. by Edith Enoni Somerville and Martin Ross. Chapter 8. The Holy Island. For 3 days of November a white fog stood motionless over the country. All day and all night smothered booms and bangs away to the south-west told that the Fastnet gun was hard at work, and the sirens of the American liners uplifted their monstrous female voices as they felt their way along the coast of Cork. On the third afternoon the wind began to whine about the windows of Sri Lane, and the barometer fell like a stone. At 11 p.m. the storm rushed upon us with the roar and the suddenness of a train. The chimneys bellowed, the tall old house quivered, and the yelling wind drove against it, as a man puts his shoulder against a door to burst it in. We none of us got much sleep, and if Mrs. Cadogan is to be believed, which experience assures me she is not, she spent the night in devotional exercises and in ministering to the panic-stricken kitchen-maid by the light of a blessed candle. All that day the storm screamed on, dry-eyed. At nightfall the rain began, and next morning, which happened to be a Sunday, every servant in the house was a messenger of Job, laden with tales of leakages, floods, and fallen trees, and inflated with the ill-concealed glory of their kind in evil tidings. To Peter Cadogan, who had been to early mass, was reserved the crowning satisfaction of reporting that a big vessel had gone on the rocks at Yocharn Point the evening before, and was breaking up fast. It was rumoured that the crew had got ashore, but this feature, being favourable and uninteresting, was kept as much as possible in the background. Mrs. Cadogan, who had been to America in an ocean liner, became at once the latest authority on shipwrecks, and was of the opinion that whoever would be drownded, it wouldn't be them lads, the sailors. Sure, wasn't there the greatest storm ever was in it the time myself was on the sea? And what had them fellows do but to put us below entirely in the ship, and close down the doors on us, the way themselves had leg it when we'd be drownding? This view of the position was so startlingly novel that Philippa withdrew suddenly from the task of ordering dinner, and fell up the kitchen stairs in unsuitable laughter. Philippa has not the most rudimentary capacity for keeping her countenance. That afternoon I was wrapped in the slumber, balmiest and most profound, that follows on a wet Sunday luncheon, when Murray, our D.I. of police, drove up in uniform, and came into the house on the top of a gust that set every door banging and every picture dancing on the walls. He looked as if his eyes had been blown out of his head, and he wanted something to eat very badly. "I've been down at the wreck since 10 o'clock this morning," he said, "waiting for her to break up, and once she does there'll be trouble. She's an American ship, and she's full up with rum and bacon and butter and all sorts. Bosanquet is there with his coastguards, and there are 500 country people on the strand at this moment, waiting for the fun to begin. I've got 10 of my fellows there now, and I wish I had as many more. You'd better come back with me, Yates. We may want the riot act before all's done." The heavy rain had ceased, but it seemed as if it had fed the wind instead of calming it, and when Murray and I drove out of Sri Lane, the whole dirty sky was moving, full sailed, in from the south-west, and the telegraph wires were hanging in a loop below the post outside the gate. Nothing except a Skiborn cart-horse would have faced the whooping charges of the wind that came at us across Corran Lake. Stimulated mysteriously by whistles from the driver, Murray's yellow hireling pounded woodenly along against the blast, till the smell of the torn seaweed was borne upon it, and we saw the Atlantic waves come towering into the bay of Traralgoch. The ship was, or had been, a 3-masted barque. 2 of her masts were gone, and her bows stood high out of water on the reef that forms one of the shark-like jaws of the bay. The long strand was crowded with black groups of people, from the bank of heavy shingle that had been hurled over onto the road, down to the slope where the waves pitched themselves and climbed and fought and tore the gravel back with them, as though they had dug their fingers in. The people were nearly all men, dressed solemnly and hideously in their Sunday clothes. Most of them had come straight from mass without any dinner, true to that Irish instinct that places its fun before its food. That the wreck was regarded as a spree of the largest kind was sufficiently obvious. Our car pulled up at a public house that stood askew between the road and the shingle. It was humming with those whom Irish publicans are pleased to call bona fides, and sundry of the same class were clustered round the door. Under the wall on the lee side was seated a bagpiper, droning out "The Irish Washerwoman" with nodding head and tapping heel, and a young man was cutting a few steps of a jig for the delectation of a group of girls. So far, Murray's constabulary had done nothing but exhibit their imposing chest measurements and spotless uniforms to the Atlantic, and Bosanquet's coastguards had only salvaged some spars, the débris of a boat, and a dead sheep. But their time was coming. As we stumbled down over the shingle, battered by the wind and pelted by clots of foam, some one beside me shouted, "She's gone!" A hill of water had smothered the wreck, and when it fell from her again, nothing was left but the bows, with the bowsprit hanging from them in a tangle of rigging. The clouds, bronzed by an unseen sunset, hung low over her. In that greedy pack of waves, with the remorseless rocks above and below her, she seemed the most lonely and tormented of creatures. About half an hour afterwards the cargo began to come ashore on the top of the rising tide. Barrels were plunging and diving in the trough of the waves, like a school of porpoises. They were pitched up the beach in waist-deep rushes of foam; they rolled down again, and were swung up and shouldered by the next wave, playing a kind of Tom Tiddler's ground with the coastguards. Some of the barrels were big and dangerous, some were small and nimble like young pigs, and the bluejackets were up to their middles as their prey dodged and ducked, and the police lined out along the beach to keep back the people. 10 men of the R.I.C. can do a great deal, but they cannot be in more than 20 or 30 places at the same instant. Therefore they could hardly cope with a scattered and extremely active mob of 400 or 500, many of whom had taken advantage of their privileges as bona fide travellers, and all of whom were determined on getting at the rum. As the dusk fell, the thing got more and more out of hand. The people had found out that the big puncheons held the rum, and had succeeded in capturing one. In the twinkling of an eye it was broached, and 50 backs were shoving round it like a football scrummage. I have heard many rows in my time. I have seen 2 Irish regiments, one of them militia, at each other's throats in Fermoy barracks. I have heard Philippa's water spaniel and 2 fox terriers hunting a strange cat round the dairy, but never have I known such untrammelled bedlam as that which yelled round the rum casks on Trellegoch strand. For it was soon not a question of 1 broached cask, or even of 2. The barrels were coming in fast, so fast that it was impossible for the representatives of law and order to keep on any sort of terms with them. The people, shouting with laughter, stove in the casks and drank the rum at 34 degrees above proof, out of their hands, out of their hats, out of their boots. Women came fluttering over the hillside through the twilight, carrying jugs, milk pails, anything that would hold the liquor. I saw one of them, roaring with laughter, tilt a filthy zinc bucket to an old man's lips. With the darkness came anarchy. The rising tide brought more and yet more booty. Great spars came lunging in on the lap of the waves, mixed up with cabin furniture, seamen's chests, and the black and slippery barrels. And the country people continued to flock in, and the drinking became more and more unbridled. Murray sent for more men and a doctor, and we slaved on hopelessly in the dark, collaring half-drunken men, shoving pig-headed casks up hills of shingle, hustling in among groups of roaring drinkers. We rescued perhaps 1 barrel in half a dozen. I began to know that there were men there who were not drunk and were not idle. I was also aware, as the strenuous hours of darkness passed, of an occasional rumble of cartwheels on the road. It was evident that the casks which were broached were the least part of the looting, but even they were beyond our control. The most that Bosanquet, Murray, and I could do was to concentrate our forces on the casks that had been secured, and to organize charges upon the swilling crowds, in order to upset the casks that they had broached. Already men and boys